So I want to make a confession. Confession is that I kind of remember when it happened. I remember what age and what I was doing when it happened. I was 24 years old, and what I was doing was I was sitting in a coffee shop in the village around University Place, and a dear mentor and teacher of mine had invited me to read a book by a woman named Alice Miller. The title of the book was The Drama of the Gifted Child. It was called Prisoners of Childhood in its first edition. And in the book, I remember Alice Miller speaking about what the great psychologist Robert Firestone would later call fantasy bonds. It's a different kind of bond. When you're in, everybody's into these bonds. The fantasy bond is the sense that we have as children because of our vulnerability and because of the innate nature of a child and the needs of the child, the deep vulnerability and exposure of the child, to imagine their parents as perfect beings. In fact, it's a salutary importance that we envision that. It helps us. We have derived great benefit from that sense of their omnipotence and their perfection. As a parent myself now, I know how far that fantasy is from the reality. But nonetheless, for children, it actually is of great importance. That fantasy bond, if exposed too early, can be deeply anxiety provoking, can create great distress in children of a certain age. Of course, it can lead, if never ever confronted, if never exposed, if never dissolved, that bond itself can lead to problems. An inability actually to do the very thing that the bond originally was intended to do, which was to protect us. It can become its own prison. An inability to see someone with their clay feet and all, to see and truly see the other. So I remember the disillusionment that was the best disillusionment that I could ever have wanted. The disillusionment of that fragile, unreal illusion. The spell, the trance was broken. I'm not going to tell you that my parents enjoyed the aftermath of that dispelled illusion. But like all reality that we must face, the illusion stands in the way of true relating. It stands in the way of true relating. Thinking about that this week, of course, because in many ways there is a great dispelling of a fantasy bond that for many of us has been so obvious that the emperor had no clothes for so long that it was a little bit scary to live in a reality where what was clearly false was paraded as true. But I also speak of the fantasy bond and the fantasy illusion of a country and a project that is so helplessly broken that we began to believe it ourselves. It was so uplifting for me, and I'm sure for so many of us, to hear Amanda Gorman bring truth and Torah to bear on Wednesday to a place that only a week or so before had been a place of deep rupture and unimaginable, incomprehensible shaking of the foundations of this great democracy. Her line that this country is not broken, it is unfinished, was both a recognition of the dark, difficult, painful, unjust elements that still inhere, while hopefully casting us towards a world that we might yet build, a world that we might yet manifest together collectively. And I think in that moment, as has already been said, as you invoked so beautifully, Maya. She did something that in this week's Torah portion also happens and is a really great reminder to all of us. This week's Torah portion, Parshat Bo, will bring us into the final three plagues, but also, most importantly, into this strange second to last plague. It's a really wild thing, guys, because when I'm thinking of plagues, when I'm thinking of things that would really, really make me uncomfortable, things that would be really problematic for me, I think that for years I wondered how the 9th plague of the 10 plagues, imagining that the plagues actually are increasing in their distress, increasing in their complexity, increasing in their pain, increasing in the quality that the plague is trying to induce in all of those who are being plagued in this story. I might have had boils up there at number 9. I might have had in number 9 slot maybe wild beasts or locusts, kind of a toss-up. Frogs could be pretty horrible, at least according to the imagination. Dam, blood, which was the first plague. But darkness as a plague. Darkness as a plague. And not only darkness as a plague, but darkness. A darkness that in so many ways, right, this darkness that appears in tomorrow morning's Torah reading, right, darkness appears in the Torah in the very beginning. Before there was light, there was dark. There's a choshech in the beginning of the Torah. There's a darkness that is a creative, alive, dynamic darkness. A darkness from which the world is born. So darkness is a plague. But if you read the plague and you think about it and think about where we are, it's just really eerie, biblical. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, God says to Moshe in chapter 10, Neteh yadcha l'shamayim v'choshech al eretz Mitzrayim. Stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt and let there be darkness. You can hear in that, V'hi choshech, right? V'hi or, in the beginning of the Torah. And God says, let there be light. Here God says, let there be dark. Let there be an absence of light. V'yamesh choshech. And let that darkness be the kind of darkness that is so thick that it can be touched. And Moses indeed stretches out his hand over Egypt, and it's a thick, a deep darkness on all of Egypt for 3 days. 3 days. And then this remarkable line. Lo ra'u ish et achiv. They couldn't see. One person could not see their brother. For 3 days they couldn't get up. They couldn't even move. But for all of the Israelites there was light. A great commentator, the Even HaEzel, one of the great commentators on this phrase, a man could not see his brother, writes, the greatest darkness is when a person doesn't see their fellow. They don't participate in the distress of other people. A man could not see his brother, he says. They didn't feel the other's distress. Their senses were dulled. This is the meaning, he says, of what our sages meant when they stated in Shemot Rabbah, in Exodus Rabbah, that the darkness was as thick as a gold dinar. The darkness was as thick as a coin. Running after golden dinarim increases one's egocentrism, he writes, dulls their eyes and makes it difficult for them to feel the distress of others. For this great commentator, the darkness in Egypt, the plague of darkness, was not only physical, but it was moral. It was ethical. There was a diminution of the ability to feel into and to be able to see one another. The darkness was itself just an expression of what was already there morally and spiritually. How many of you have thought over the last year that this horrific pandemic in some way was telling a story better than any other story that we could have imagined about the ways that we are isolated from one another, the ways that we forget about how the simplest of touches can convey and can transmit so much. How many of us have thought, of course, not biblically, and God forbid this isn't right, it's horrible, we wish it never had happened, but how many of us have thought about how the very thing which is so lacking at this moment is the very thing that had become so diluted, the public space and the ability to be with one another within safety, and then there was none. How many of us have thought that that great virus that has come upon us is just in some level an expression of a spiritual virus, of a moral virus, of a tribalism and an egocentrism and a narcissism that was so rampant and so violent in its expression, that this actual pandemic is expressing something that on a spiritual level many of us have felt for so many years. But for the Israelites there was light in their dwelling places. Perhaps we can read that sentence not as a contrast, not as for the Egyptians and for the Mitzrim, they couldn't see each other, and we Jews had it great. There was light in our dwelling places, but when there was a lack of love, a lack of care, a lack of consideration, an inability to see the pain of one another, the inability to actually check those values, we focused on creating light in our dwelling places. That we said and asked ourselves, how can we be those who are seeing one another? How can we be those who believe that if we see each other, truly see each other in our dwelling places, in our small sanctuaries and private spaces, beginning here and rippling out, that itself can be an antidote, maybe. I might have thought that was a little bit too something. But then to hear again Amanda Gorman and her prophetic call, her channeled words, that when we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid, the new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, she wrote. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So in the dark night, a night that itself can become creative, a night itself that can be not the dark night of an unethical, solipsistic, self-secure tribalism, but a dark night that if we pass through, if we in the dark night sow light, then we can see it, we can be it. So tonight at your dinner table, I hope you'll talk about what this year has been like in terms of the darkness and what you've been able to see even in the dark, and ways in which the darkness reflects maybe a darkness that preceded this inability to leave our place in space. Maybe you'll share the Torah of the light that you have sown and seen, and maybe even share a dream of how you might not only sow it and see it, but be it. Darkness is a plague, but we might learn to see in the dark and through it and with it. May God give us that strength.